anyone welcome everyone who's come today. And I will be monitoring chat. So if you have any questions along the way, just please type them in. We'll hold off on our Q&A till the end of the session, and I will share the questions with our guests today.
Thank you, Kelly Roisman. My name is Frieda Afary. I am an Iranian-American librarian, translator, and writer based in Los Angeles. And I'm honored to be here as part of Library 2.0 with my colleague, Wonda Powell, who is a professor of Emerita of History at Los Angeles Southwest College and author of the poetry collection, Girl, Find Me a Safety Pin, and a lover of libraries. We have two PowerPoint presentations, and the overall title, as you know, is Librarians as Stewards of Knowledge, Critical Thinking, Empathy, and Truth. Each of us will speak for about 10 minutes, and then there will be at least 5 or 6 minutes for a time for questions and comments. And I would like to acknowledge that San Jose State University has been, in addition to Library 2.0, which is the main sponsor, San Jose State University is the additional partner, as well as Urban Libraries, and we thank them all. So to start my presentation, in a recent interview with the New York Times, the famed Russian writer Sorokin says that faced with authoritarianism in Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he sees the conflict not just as a military onslaught, but as a war being waged I'm sorry, one moment, I need to move my screen. Oops, sorry. I'm sorry, Kelly, the images are covering my text, so may I just minimize the images? Okay, I did, that's fine. So Vladimir Sorokin says that faced with authoritarianism in Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he, quote, sees the conflict not just as a military onslaught, but as a semantic war being waged through propaganda and lies, an assault on truth that writers must combat. This is the end of the quote from Sorokin. Today in the US and around the world, we are all facing a destructive assault on truth and the use of disinformation and book bans to ideologically condition millions. Given the growth of white supremacy, misogyny, and fascism in the US, fueled by disinformation, librarians have a critical responsibility in confronting this situation. We are, after all, masters of library and information science. So as a public librarian with over 20 years of experience, I see our responsibility on 3 different levels. First, promoting regular discussion groups on news literacy and current world events at community branches. Secondly, offering workshops on the basic principles of critical thinking. Thirdly, promoting discussion on US history from the vantage point of critical thinking. So what is critical thinking? In general, in order to be successful in helping the public distinguish between fact and fiction, whether in relationship to current events or US history, we need to provide library patrons with ways of understanding the basic principles of critical thinking. In this regard, librarians have a great resource in the work of Marianne Wolf, author of the book Reader Come Home, and a professor at the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. Wolf's main arguments in Reader Come Home, which was published in 2018, are the following. First, over-reliance on digital reading is doing long-term damage to our memory, our ability for critical thinking, reflection, empathy, and democracy itself. Secondly, if we build on the best characteristics of both print and digital mediums, we can develop what she calls biliterate persons with ever more sophisticated forms of cognition and imagination that will enable our children to leap into new worlds of knowledge. End of quote from Woolf. The latter possibility, in other words, the possibility of developing these biliterate persons who are ever more sophisticated, the latter possibility requires the practice of what Woolf calls deep reading. So what is deep reading? Deep reading begins with attention, remembering, following the sequence of the text narrative, and drawing connections between the observations and questions gleaned. It requires putting oneself in the position of others. It is thus connected to empathy as both knowledge of and feeling for the other. Deep reading, Woolf argues, requires that readers approach the text with internalized background knowledge, including conceptual frameworks that allow us to draw meaning, inferences, engage in critical analysis, evaluate the writer's assumptions, ideas, conclusions, and reflect on the whole process in order to arrive at new insights and thoughts. Our conceptual frameworks need to be flexible enough to be open to new ideas, changes, expansion, and enrichment. Deep reading, she argues, is the antidote to disinformation, manipulation, and demagoguery. When we do not read deeply and do not delve into complexities, we can become prey to simplistic answers, homogenization of thinking, and extremes. So what does critical thinking, deep reading, and empathy demand in the United States context? And here I want to argue, and this is not in directly in Marianne Wolf's book, but I want to take off from there and argue that we can learn from Bryan Stevenson and Nikole Hannah-Jones on confronting racism, and from Audre Lorde on confronting racism, misogyny, sexism, and homophobia. Bryan Stevenson, in the documentary True Justice, or rather in the documentary True Justice, which is about Bryan Stevenson, a human rights attorney who has represented inmates on death row, Stevenson argues that in the United States, we live in a post-genocide society. The genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans, he argues, was justified by presenting them as inferior or subhuman. This view of the other as inferior, he insists, can only be overcome if the US population confronts and reflects on its history of slavery, lynchings, segregation, and the present system of mass incarceration, which disproportionately affects Black people and people of color. Stevenson emphasizes, until we tell the truth, this is a quote from him, until we tell the truth, we deny ourselves the opportunity for justice and redemption. End of quote. It is only through a process of what he calls transitional justice, in which specific steps are taken to reverse and repair this damage, that true reconciliation can be achieved. That process, he argues, begins with confronting the ideology of white supremacy in which, quote, a Black person is viewed as a criminal, unquote. The process of transitional justice also requires challenging any form of otherizing and demonizing other people, such as Asians or Latinos or the LGBTQ community. Stevenson adds that he, quote, has no interest in punishment. My interest is in liberation, end of quote, which cannot be achieved if we remain silent. So Nikole Hannah-Jones, why is she really relevant to this discussion on critical thinking? The work of Nikole Hannah-Jones, New York Times journalist, has also been an important contribution of the broader movement for Black lives. She conceived and produced the Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project, published on the 400th anniversary of the entry of the first African enslaved person into Jamestown. This special 1619 issue of the New York Times magazine started new debates about the racist and anti-Black foundations of the US and its legacy of slavery. And then finally, Audre Lorde. Why am I taking up Audre Lorde? Audre Lorde is a poet, or was a poet, writer, and librarian who challenged men, white or Black, who disparaged Black feminists and lesbians, and who continued to treat women in sexist and patriarchal ways. She called on them to turn their rage toward capitalism and argued that Black men are also diminished by sexism, which robs them of meaningful connections to Black women. Lorde also sharply critiqued white feminists who took Black women for granted, who did not make a conscious, consistent, and persistent effort to reach out to Black women, to learn about their experiences and contributions, or did not engage them in a dialogue on liberation. In Lorde's famous essay, "The Master's Tool Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," she challenged a concept of difference that is limited to pluralism and does not go beyond legitimizing domination. And to conclude, I want to say that I have more to say about all these issues in my forthcoming book, Socialist Feminism: A New Approach, which also articulates a socialist, humanist, and feminist alternative. I would like to return, and finally, I would like to return to the point I began with, which was the global assault on truth, the genocidal consequences of this assault, and the responsibilities of librarians for confronting this assault. Around the world, so many doors are being closed to any efforts to promote truth. In the US too, we're seeing a growing wave of authoritarianism and fascism, and yet we still have many opportunities, such as this conference, to make a difference. I hope we will live up to the challenge. Thank you all. And now I would like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Wonda Powell.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to start with truth and empathy. It's important to understand that a healthy society requires truth. It requires empathy and integrity, if we were, really poignant to bring these things to bear. These are values that a healthy society requires. James Baldwin puts it very succinctly in this slide, okay? Next, please. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's actually faced. And nothing can be faced without truth. To just throw around facts without any concept of their meaning or the context in which they were brought to being, you then corrupt, facts. You corrupt the very idea of truth. You must go deeper. And in the Stanford study on history education, they talk about the necessity, as Ms. Afary has just talked about, you have to read deeply. You have to think critically. You have to evaluate your resources, corroborate any of the different viewpoints. You have to back up any claims with any evidence from original documents. And basically, George Packer talks about in his recent article that critical thinking, is the very methodology that is missing because many of our citizens are not truth seekers. They're not looking at the means by which you are able to discern the truth. A citizen who wants to enjoy their own freedom must be able to enjoy with civic discourse, with civic decision-making to protect everyone's rights. White supremacy, as we are seeing in our society today, is a destruction of humanity. It is not just a destruction of our society, our government. It is a destruction. And in its wake, there is only chaos. Next, people in a democracy are required to think for themselves. They have to think for themselves. The attempt to overthrow our government on January 6th showed how a small cabal of criminal oligarchs, many of them CEOs of American companies, have assuaged the fears of the populace during the last decades, this last decades of long, chaotic 2008 economic crisis and the health crisis that we just in terms of called COVID-19 and now 5 and 6. We have to these things are tearing away at the very fabric of values of truth, the very fabric of what it means to be compassionate. People are corrupting. It faces the needs, okay, of the oligarchs and a continuous Orwellian narrative of lies built on a foundation of ignorance. Unprecedented in the 21st century, but it is a cycle. Because if we did a close analysis of the causes of the Civil War, we would see slave owners convincing 3/4 of the South that did not own slaves. You would see them convincing the other, basically to protect the interests of the 1/4 who did. Also in opposition to their own interests and their own well-being. How do you convince someone to cause their own destruction? It is through lies, exploitation of ignorance. It's through pitting the majority of the people together that are mislabeled minorities. But these allied minorities are the majority. The goal of oligarchs, is to basically argue about identity. Who is an American? To argue about origin and what is real history and what is the real history. Someone wants to call slavery relocation, forceful relocation. Forceful relocation is when your parents take you across town. A new school, okay? But no, when we see these pictures of Pericles on his funeral oration, when we look at Abraham Lincoln and we basically, in terms of the situations that we're doing, one of the things that you will see is that in the Gettysburg Address, he talks about the sacrifices made. And when we listen to the confirmation hearings of Ketanji Brown Jackson, it is for the living that we have to understand that this new birth of freedom, quoting Lincoln, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. We are at that crucible. We're at that point when not only Black lives matter, because we have to remember the great number of people that we have lost, ordinary people who are being sacrificed. So if you care about democracy, the next slide, if you care about the democracy and this experiment called the United States, then you have to be concerned about why the boardroom, there is a George Floyd. In the colleges, there is a Sandra Bland. In a marriage, there is Vincent Chin, who got beaten and never on his night of celebration of his bachelor days in Detroit. And we have to understand that Jalen Walker in Akron, Ohio did not get to face because there were 90 bullets riveting in his body. He had to face, he turned his back to run. We have to pay attention. You must have the courage not to yield to falsehood and despondency. And it is in libraries, the visionary places where stewards, people like yourselves, who understand that humanity requires a civic community able to express themselves to others. Listen to varying viewpoints and think with an open mind. Analyze again and again. Think, share, talk with clarity of thought, and then think again about what you have learned from the other. The enhancement of the process requires not only exposure to good books, but those books which often create conflict within our own readers' world. Conflict and exposure to diverse worlds beyond those that we already know. What is the American dilemma that Theodore Dreiser was talking about? We have to look at, if we, and if you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, then you would understand that Brittany Griner is in hell? What courage would be needed right now when you look at the picture of Emmett Till's mother, who courageously showed the body of her child tortured and abused? Then your heart goes out to the parents in Uvalde, Texas, because what courage that Emmett Till's mother had, that what would it take when we see this tragedy unfold over and over again, and the hypocrisy of those who would talk about the rule of law? Good literature, books help all people face not only the external existential world, but the inner demons and conflicts faced by human beings. Let's go. Here we go. Here's an example. Intersectionality, also created by Kimberle Crenshaw and Derek Bell, her mentor. You have to read, if you want to read books, faces at the end, okay? At the very end, okay, busy. I have only a few seconds. That bell is going off, okay? The important thing for you to understand is where she says the opposition to patriarchy, race and gender politics often ends up being antagonistic to each other and both interests. You have to understand that racism is the child of slavery. And no more can you take, look at your palm, look at the palm of your hand, talk about the palm without, turn it over. Can you talk about the palm without the full view of both sides of your hand? Thwart the divisive, the division, conquer strategy. We have to figure out a way to stop those who foment hate, not only within themselves, but that is thrown and thrust out to us. We no longer have to accept the defilers of democracy. We must be allowed to, we can't allow them to destroy history. Read books like The American Holocaust by David E. Stannard. And understand that from the time that Columbus got lost and came to America, in that extension of time, over 100 million Native Americans have died. Some of them were killed intentionally, not inadvertently. The reinventing of the history books is because they do not want to be held accountable for the deaths of millions of people. Not held accountable. Are we talking here also in the 21st century, how many people do not want to be held accountable? Will the Supreme Court be held accountable? Please understand, I want you to be feeling good about what you do, that you do an important job. You protect knowledge. And when you do this, this is not a truth of my truth or your particular truth. It is the truth that must be protected. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wonda Powell. And now we're going to have just a few minutes for questions and comments, and looking forward to any questions or comments that you might have.
You have to unmute yourself if you're going to make a question.
Oh, okay. Now I'm looking. I'm sorry. I thought Kelly was going to read the.
Well, she might. We're helping each other.
Okay. So now I'm looking at the chat, and so there's a question from Rebecca saying, "Thank you both for your thoughtful presentations. I'm curious how you protect your emotional selves throughout the process of your truth-telling and empathy work."
I'll take that one.
Would you like to answer that?
Yes, it's empowering. Truth is empowering. It gives you the strength to not become despondent, not to subject yourself to the distractions. The truth, and when you often hear people say, I walk in my truth. John Lewis, I walk in my truth. It is empowering for you. And then you will find that there are other people just like you who understands I, as an American citizen, should not have to beg for my rights. It required a Voting Rights Act for many people to have the opportunity to vote. That should be protected. And I will fight for that all the days of my life, and to honor my grandparents, to honor the people in American history from the beginning.
Yes, and I agree. I agree that truth is empowering, and that the more you know and the more you learn, the stronger you feel, the more capable of handling the difficulties of this very difficult moment that we're living in.
Thank you for that great question, Rebecca.
Yes. Any other questions? I mean, I don't see anything in the chat, but again, you can unmute yourself if you want to just—
or raise your hand in the reaction.
Raise your hand, yes.
I'm wondering, what can librarians do? I think, how can we best act?
Oh, well, that's what I tried to discuss in the— here, let me go back to that slide where I began by saying that I said that I see our responsibility on 3 different levels. First, promoting regular discussion groups on news literacy and current world events at community branches. Secondly, offering workshops on the basic principles of critical thinking. Thirdly, promoting discussion on US history from the vantage point of critical thinking. So that's what I would suggest.
Where would be the places you recommend to go as far as finding resources to help us?
PEN America is a great resource, and also the American Library Association. And if you want to do current events discussion groups, I would just say if you read the New York Times on a regular basis, you will find plenty there that you can discuss. And yeah, so those are the sources that I would recommend. And of course, some of the sources that I recommended earlier, the book by Marianne Wolf itself could be a great book discussion. Then the documentary film about Bryan Stevenson, the 1619 Project, the Nikole Hannah-Jones, and then the collection or selection of writings by Audre Lorde that Roxane Gay just published about 1.5 years ago with a new introduction.
Good question. Any more?
We have 1 more minute before people have to go.
Wanda, I wonder, could you give me, oh, we have a hand up. No, we have a hand up with Lisa. Go ahead, please.
Okay, no, basically, it's very important to listen to programs like Democracy Now!, the American Historical Association, and also Christine Amanpour. They stay really on target in terms of some suggestions and ideas that will inspire you to possibly reach out to others.
Okay. I'm Lisa. I'd also suggest going to the source. There are a number of bookstores that are Black ownership, where you see a preponderance of books. I mean, I had to do it on my own. I'm 60 years now, and I started my education with regards to the true history of this country way back in my late teens, because my father was Danish, and he was also very open to making sure that I learned the history, not just what I was being taught in schools. And so I very early learned about Medgar Evers and about the civil rights leaders of that time, and about writers, Bell Hooks, all of these great writers out there. All I can say is find Black groups or literature groups, or groups that do book clubs. Go to someone and ask them what their favorite book was. What are the books that they read? I mean, my whole point is that you can't see it from the outside. You have to go to the source. You have to ask people what inspired them, who inspired them. James Baldwin is a huge inspiration. And when I hear that somebody like Fran Lebowitz, who's very well known in certain circles, her first intellectual was a Black man, and that was James Baldwin. You should be everybody's intellectual. The man spoke the truth, and so does Robert Jones Jr. He just wrote a brilliant book, The Prophets. There are so many out there to reach out to, and all I can say is we've only hit the tip of the iceberg. There are so many voices. Jessamine Ward. I mean, gosh. Anyway, sorry.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Because our time is up, I just want to respond to a couple of questions on the chat. I really, really appreciate what you said, Lisa. And please get in touch with us. And Keru says, how can librarians protect themselves when they tell the truth? Well, I think that if you stick to really well recognized sources that check their facts, no one can accuse you of lying or having an ideological intention. That's what the books that are very well recognized, sources that do tremendous fact checking, I would say stick to those sources. And secondly, a question from Megan, my professional life was begun based in a theory as society would improve with increased access to quality information. And as society has a hunger for learning, now I see fewer answer seekers. And our community wants to use online resources. Okay, I think that also goes back to what Marianne Wolf is saying about how the over-reliance on digital media is making us unreflective. And so people aren't paying attention, they're not remembering. So that's all the more reasons for librarians to emphasize that we have to read carefully and slowly, and that there's some things that we read very, very slowly, and then some things that we can skim through, but not everything can be skimmed through. It's our responsibility to talk about these issues right now. So I'm so sorry that we can't answer any more questions.
One last thing, in terms of protecting yourself, when you tell the truth, you will be attacked. Please be aware of that and prepare in that sense for that.
Yes.
And so you will talk to the other friends, and you can contact us as well. We'll give you some more ideas when we have more time. Thank you.
Somebody else says, Tears We Cannot Stop by Michael Eric Dyson. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you, Wonda Powell. Thank you, Kelly, for helping us. Thank you, Library 2.0, Stephen Hargadon. And looking forward to being in touch with those who want to contact us. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. We stop recording?
One moment.